which is manifest in this community. We've experienced it a number of times this year, both in this series and even recently with the visitation of Chancellor Helmut Schmidt just this week, or with Saturday's student celebration, where our students who volunteer to help the handicapped in the city brought together literally hundreds of people who have been probably blessed by God more than us, but aren't like us, at the Fitzpatrick Athletic Field, to move with them hand in hand and to take them through games for a very joyous situation. This very room, and I think most of you are here for the first time, is an example of our ambitions for our university in this city. We call this the Royals Room. It was a gift of Brian Murray and his family. And on the side to your right are the pictures of the family in whose name this room is honored. His father, who taught us how to think, Brian said. His mother, who taught us how to love. And his brother. And in every picture around here, we haven't picked the stars, though there are a few stars, athletic stars in the pictures. We picked symbols of what we thought the students should be inspired to do. That is, to play vigorously, to enjoy it, and I feel like Jeff Paterno now, and to win, if at all possible. And so it's quite by accident that every picture we have here is a triumph. And I think this evening is a triumph. It's a symbol of what we've accomplished through this chair, and we thank all of you who have helped us to build this series. Thank you very much.
Let me add my welcome to you on tonight, the occasion of this sixth spring lecture presented by the Judaic Studies program. Tonight is particularly enjoyable because we welcome to the podium a man who has already shared with us his wisdom and skill, both as we struggled with the task of developing the then fledgling Judaic Studies program, and later in a faculty symposium for the local community. Although I am sure that most of you know a good deal about the program here at the university, please indulge me as I acquaint those new friends who are here and bring our old friends up to date. The purpose of the Judaic Studies program is to enable the university and the larger community to gain a better understanding and appreciation of Judaism, Israel, and their histories. Thanks to an endowment generously supported by the local community, Jewish community, we have been able to bring to the campus internationally recognized scholars in Judaic studies here to meet with faculty, students, and friends of the university. The most recent example was a 2-day, 3-session seminar with faculty and students conducted by Professor Yosef Yerushalmi, the Salo Whitmire Barron Professor of History at Columbia University. His seminar was on Jewish emancipation during the Enlightenment, and it was attended by a total of approximately 30 people. This is but the most recent of such events, the others of which are listed in your program. We have also sent a number of faculty to Israel through a program established by the American Association of Professors for Peace in the Middle East. These are study missions in which faculty are given a tour of Israel while meeting with noted political and academic figures. The schedules of such trips are jam-packed and exhausting, but also exhilarating. It is a remarkable experience, one which has left all of us fortunate enough to be able to go, with indelible impressions and greater understanding. These are but some of the examples of what we do in the program, and I encourage you to approach a program committee member if you have any questions or suggestions. The program committee members here tonight are Professor Stephen Casey of the Theology Department, Mrs. Sandra Myers, the Reverend Richard Rousseau, also of the Theology Department, and Mr. Seymour Brotman. Our prayers go out to Father John J. Burns, who could not be here tonight because of some recent surgery, but whose spirit has been with us every step of the way. Now let me turn to tonight's speaker. The Rabbi Irving Greenberg is no stranger to the Scranton area. He is an accomplished lecturer and author who has concentrated his efforts on a number of important topics. He has worked to foster Jewish-Christian dialogue, to foster dialogue within the varied constituencies of the Jewish community itself, and to incorporate an understanding of the Holocaust and the state of Israel into an understanding of divine purpose in history. To further these concerns, Rabbi Greenberg is also the president and co-founder of CLAL, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership. More about Rabbi Greenberg may be found in your program, and I do not wish to simply recite his achievements. Instead, I would like to recover one of his achievements. In the fall of 1984, Rabbi Greenberg met with a number of faculty and students to discuss the dynamics of covenant. In an insight that still has me in wonder, he said that to understand the covenant, one must understand that while man learns from his experience with the divine learns from his contact with us. The covenant is fundamentally a learning relationship in which both sides acquire insight they did not have before. That to me is a remarkable insight, and in the hope that both divine and human learning may inspire us tonight, I give you tonight's speaker, Rabbi Irving Greenberg.
Thank you very much. My topic tonight is a new encounter of Judaism and Christianity. And I might start by explaining that topic. And that is, it is based on a thesis, if you will, that we are having a new encounter, a rather remarkable encounter of two religions which grew up together. Christianity grew in the bosom of Judaism, and yet, in their very first meeting, did not have a serious encounter with each other. Or rather, we have the history of 1,800 years of a misencounter between the two. What we are now engaged in its own remarkable way, is an attempt to see whether after 1,800 years, one can encounter anew someone and go back through or beyond the hatred, the misunderstanding, the conflict, and the different perspectives and the different history, and see if both religions cannot not only meet each other in a new way, but perhaps understand themselves anew in light of the new encounter. This new encounter, therefore, is a remarkable saga in religious as well as human history. And it's made possible, I think in good measure, by three events that have come together, particularly in this community. The three events are modern culture, perhaps I might even call it postmodern culture, the arrival of what is clearly the most open and the most highly communicative culture of all time. We are living through nothing less than what I would call a universalization of culture, in which, for the first time in human history, every religion and every culture is available to every other, without shielding and without filters. We are living through it this very evening. We take it for granted, but think for a moment of the fact that a Catholic university, whose mission includes the transmission and the teaching of Catholic religion, considers it not only valid, but important in its own program to offer Judaism and the Jewish understanding of Judaism to its own students and faculty. I mean, nothing is sacred anymore. In the good old days when I grew up, each religion knew it had the truth, and the last thing you felt you owed to another religion was to present its viewpoint. To the extent that one would present the other viewpoint, and I plead guilty for the same thing, I constantly use Christianity as the foil of all the wonderful examples of how Judaism is wonderful. We believe in saintly family life, whereas Christianity has these monastic orders that involve the priests. The best people don't have families. Could there be a more perfect triumphalist way of pointing out Judaism's superiority to a Jewish family audience? So it was, Christianity was kind of the foil. Just as I recall, still my first interfaith encounter in a church, when they read a passage, I forget now exactly where it was from, in which there's this great hero, Jesus, and of course there were these two Jewish characters, Moses and Elijah, in the background, who stand there, of course, to tell you how great Jesus is. And of course, what could be more credible and effective to a Christian audience than that kind of thing? But now, for the first time in history, the other is present. And you not only no longer can depend on having a sheltered environment, but in some real sense we have come to affirm this as a positive good. And so we have the kind of program we have tonight. I don't think people can appreciate yet the revolutionary implications. In fact, I'm not even sure we can make it, to be honest about it, because never before in human history have we had a situation where any sort of value system, not just Jewish and not just Christian, but any value system has ever thought to pass itself on in the presence of every other value system respectfully portrayed. The most powerful force in all value transmission is the fact that this is the only way. The most powerful force in values is the fact that it's self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Among the most immortal lines of American history and of American public discourse. What was the most powerful element in that sentence? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. What's the most remarkable phrase in that whole sentence? It's, of course, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What made it revolutionary was because it was self-evident that they were entitled to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Well, we're living in a world where nothing is self-evident anymore. This is the remarkable breakthrough because every alternative value system is now available. Let me put it outside of the Jewish-Christian context. One of my strongest memories as a child was growing up in World War II. That was probably the last war where we had an enemy that was self-evident. And of course I don't joke about it because it was a self-evident enemy, but my strongest memory of that war as a child was not the war, of course, but the portrayal of that war in the mass media. And my strongest memory of all is Wake Island. If there's anyone alive in this audience who remembers that great film, Wake Island, it starred my two heroes, Robert Taylor and Brian Dunleavy. And of course, the reason I will never forget it is that I was so determined to go see this film that I told my parents I wanted to see it. My heroes were in this. And they forbade me to go. And I was so determined to go that although I was a very sincere and religious yeshiva bacher who had never defied his parents, after all, it says in the Bible, you shall honor your father and mother. That's ancient history, of course. At the time, I was so inspired by the desire to see this film that I cut school, Yeshiva Eitz Chaim, and I snuck off to the Loews Borough Park Theater to see my hero. So I recall very clearly, I'll never forget the whole experience, first of all, because I left the school, and I knew by doing that I was condemned to eternal hell. But of course, for Robert Taylor, it was worth it. So I went happily to the movie. And of course, I'll never forget that moment, because when I arrived at the box office, I discovered with the most devastating moment of truth that the movie had a deal with my school not to allow kids in during school hours without an adult accompanying them. Well, of course, I was totally shattered. What went through my mind, of course, is the saddest line in the Yom Kippur service, which says, "We strayed from your good commandments and good paths, and it wasn't even worth it." And of course, I stood there not knowing what to do. I mean, I was really totally lost, and I couldn't go back to school. My bridges were burned, but I couldn't get in. As I stood there, an old man came by. Of course, years later, I realized this was Elijah the prophet in disguise. But he saw me crying, and he asked me why I'm crying. I explained this devastating moment. He bought a ticket, took me in. He didn't stay to watch the film because he wasn't interested, but he didn't want this young. So that would have made it the most unforgettable experience of my life just for that alone. But believe it or not, the movie topped this unforgettable experience, and that's the point I want to make. And what part of the movie? It's the last scene. For those of you who may recall the story of Wake Island, either in the film or in history, the Marines are cut off on this island, Wake Island. For 42 days and nights, they are shelled and bombarded by the Japs. Not the Japanese, by the Japs. And they are totally cut off. They're out of ammunition, they're out of water, they're out of food, they're out of everything. And finally, a Japanese armada invades the island to conquer and destroy the Marines. And of course, they've got to evacuate them. So they've got to evacuate them, but they have Robert Taylor. He has one machine gun to hold off the 50,000 Japs while the Marines escape on the other side of the island. He's totally not afraid. In fact, it's wonderful. This last scene was mine, really. first of all, he comes on the scene after 40 days and nights, no shaving, he has got a perfectly pressed uniform. He looks like a hero, not like today, they look like Shamazo. He looked like a real hero. And when the 50,000 Japs hit the beach, he's not afraid, he says, "Come on, you guys!" And of course, when they hit the beach, he opens fire. With every burst, 3,000 Japs drop in on his squad. Actually, first they tell you they're buck teeth, then they drop dead, because they're bad guys. And as the movie ends, he is mowing down the Japs left and right. The audience gave him a standing ovation. Now you contrast that scene with any scene that comes to your mind about the Vietnam War. And what comes to your mind? A little girl running down the road on fire from the pond that we set, and you see the pain in her face? Or a police chief of Saigon shooting a guerrilla in the head, and you see the moment of death, and you feel this tremendous agony of a human life snuffed out? That's the revolution. In the past, they were Japs and gooks and geeks and everything else, and that's why you could kill them without thinking twice. And suddenly, because of this incredible power of the communication of the world we live in, they're living flesh and blood. They're human beings, like us. We feel their pain. And in fact, it's no accident, therefore, that the Vietnam War was resisted internally in America as almost no other war. In fact, I've many times thought maybe we're lucky that there was no television in World War II. I sometimes have this nightmare of, CBS person to person, or Ed Morrow, someone like that, or 2020 visits, except now it's adversarial, but Ed Morrow's of the old style, visits Rudolph Huss, on Christmas Eve. And you see the family sitting around and they've got this wonderful party going and they sing Christmas carols. And he's kind to his dog. He was kind to his dog. Who would want to go fight Rudolph Huss? Of course, if you looked outside and across the street, he was the commandant at Auschwitz. And across the street, they were burning children alive. But if you saw this warm, kind, wonderful man, gracious man to his own family, who would want to go fight him? That is part of the revolution we're just beginning to wrestle with. Which is that when every alternate value system is present with such vividness and such humanity and such power, is it possible to communicate one's own values? But the good side of that is, in all candor, I think, a remarkable human breakthrough. Suddenly, for Jews, Catholics are not just believers in another religion, or the representatives of a hateful, persecuting hierarchy, or, for that matter, the easy dismissal of somebody who believes in a religion that's so superstitious. Those were the cheap terms we had as childhood. They believed in saints, and those saints are practically believing like miracles. And all those shorthand, cheap, dismissing images disintegrate in the presence of the sheer religious and human reality of the other. And suddenly, for Christians, Jews are not just the children of some Pharisaic legalists, devilish figures, but they become flesh and blood neighbors and friends, and suddenly the old theology and the old description, even the New Testament, doesn't feel so comfortable anymore. Think of poor Bailey Smith, who grew up in a typical sheltered and devout Protestant home and knew the truth that God has appeared through Jesus Christ in the flesh, and we are saved through Jesus, and therefore we can only be saved through Jesus. And who unselfconsciously, as president of the Southern Baptist Convention, simply let slip, well, of course God can't hear the prayer of Jews. And suddenly, terribly embarrassed, worldwide scandal, and the whole American country's up in arms. And he's got to apologize. But the truth is, he didn't mean it. All he was trying to say was that I believe absolutely in Jesus. But all those years, the easy stereotype was that this is the faith of religious experience, and the other faith is some desiccated and fossil religion. And suddenly, in the glaring spotlight, has to confront the truth of the reality of Jewish religious experience, which if he doesn't know it, other Christians know it, and they force him to confront it. You know what he had to do? He had to apologize, and he had to accept an invitation to attend somebody's Passover Seder and sit through the whole Seder. I called his hostess and said, give him some really hard knedlach. That'll teach him a lesson. And he had to repent. These are extraordinary experiences. I don't think we're just beginning to grasp what it means, because of course it's humorous on one level, but on a deeper level it is forcing the revision of our own most fundamentally held truths. And the truth is we're just beginning to touch that, and that's the first element in the new encounter. The other two elements are also very obvious. They come out of the historical experience of our lifetime. A painful, exhilarating, devastating experience for all of us. First and foremost, of course, the Holocaust. A week ago we commemorated, I should say, Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day. What a shattering experience in terms of the existing relationships of Jews and Christians. For 1,800 years we had relationships, and they disintegrated under the impact of this event. For Christians, there was the pain and the guilt and the soul-searching of the Christian contribution to make this possible. It's not that the Nazis were simply Christians. Most of them were anti-Christian. But that they had grown up in a culture 1,800 years Christian, that they were able to appeal to existing stereotypes, existing negative, hateful images of Jews, in order to single out the Jews for this incredible faith, and that those images were planted and nurtured by a classic Christian theology. And suddenly Christians had to confront the truth that they in the past did not have to see, that Jews have flesh and blood and they bleed and they suffer, but that we're responsible for that suffering, that the gospel of love, self-image, the true image of Christianity, now confronts the bitter truth through communication, that it has caused suffering, pain, death to good people, people I can't explain away as children of the devil or generations of vipers. And of course, Christians have to wrestle with the question whether the past tradition of Christian images of Jews and the past encounter did not lead to indifference. One of the most terrible things about the whole Holocaust experience is that it was not the Nazi behavior, they were the killers of course, but it was not the Nazi behavior that decided how many Jews would survive. Nor was it Jewish behavior, they were the victims of course, but whatever they did, whether they ran or stood, whether they raised arms or whether they went passively, that did not change the survival rate. But the key element that made the difference was the behavior of the bystanders. If the local population resisted, the Jews survived more. If the local population cooperated, Jews survived less. And so every Christian theologian, ethicist, had asked himself to what extent Christianity paved the way for that indifference. And for Jews equally, the Holocaust is shattering to past relationships to Judaism and Christianity. For one, in all bluntness, because Jews now understand that as bad as Christianity was, it was far from the worst. And these easy shorthand Jewish views that the modern culture is great because it liberated us from Christianity and from Christian domination do not begin to approach the dealing with the reality that in this modern culture came the most disastrous and evil and total attack on the Jewish people of all time. Or for that matter, Jews confronting the truth that unless in some way they broke this relationship to Christianity of mutual contempt and hatred, that unless they broke that relationship, they would be vulnerable again and again, and that therefore they could literally not go on safely with the past relationship. Or for that matter, when the Jews develop even deeper self-insight, there is the even more searching question that they must address to themselves, which is there not present in Judaism and in Jewish culture a counterpart tradition of contempt for the other? Are there not shorthand stereotypes and a sense of Gentile negativism that could easily tempt us into the same kind of reaction? We now know from the Holocaust that if you have spiritual contempt for somebody else, it will show up eventually in indifference to their physical fate and their physical behavior. You can't say, you're wonderful, but your religion is contemptible, without in the long run, because frankly, religion is so important that if somebody is wonderful but their religion is contemptible, then they're also contemptible. Because if your religion is so contemptible, why are you practicing? So in a very real sense, we've come to see that Jewish self-understanding and Christian self-understanding cannot go on with the negative images of the other without risking their own souls and a repetition of doing unto others what was done to themselves. And the third element in this new encounter, I believe, of course, is something we celebrate this very evening around the world in Jewish people. It is Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day. It's the celebration of Israel's remarkable, miraculous restoration. But I believe that restoration also paves the way for a new relationship between Jews and Christians. And again, from both sides. For Christians, the state of Israel puts fini, if there was anything left, to the credibility of the theology of the wandering Jew, of the Jew who was in permanent exile and degradation because they have not accepted Jesus. For that matter, to the extent that Christianity thought that someday its truth would be upheld by the disappearance of Judaism, and that was a fundamental Christian belief and hope for 1800 years, then it becomes clear with the state of Israel that Jews will not disappear unless there's another genocide, God forbid. A genocide which obviously would have to be a collaboration, in which Christianity would be so ethically implicated that to all practical purposes it would be finished anyway, that no person of conscience could ever believe in it anyway. So in a sense, Christianity, the temptation of Christians to think they'll outlive the Jews is removed by the rebirth of the state of Israel. And on the other hand, for Jews, in a paradoxical sort of way, the state of Israel gives them a new confidence, a new sense of self that enables them to think differently about Christianity. Because for the past 1800 years, Jews have, in a way, not been able to afford the luxury of appreciating Christianity. We were surrounded by majority culture. We were under pressure theologically, socially, politically by Christians. It's very hard to relax and see in Christianity the religious profundity, the religious and spiritual depth of that religion. It's hard enough to reject it when you're a oppressed minority, when you think it's a rotten religion, when you think that its practitioners must be ignorant and superstitious. I can't afford the luxury of appreciating its spiritual grandeur, or its models of ethical accomplishment, or its saints. But in a paradoxical sort of way, when Jews become self-secure, when in this country, because of acceptance, and in Israel, because they're majority, we now have the self-respect and the dignity not to be worried about what others think of us all the time, then Jews can relax enough to listen and suddenly discover that that religion which they had written off as a religion either of contempt or of inferiority is in fact a religion of extraordinary religious depth and power. So I believe that we are just at the very beginning of this new discovery of each other, of this new confrontation with the truth and the power of what the other stands for. We've seen it, interestingly enough, in the very first beginnings in the work of men like Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig. Buber, who caused such a storm, it's hard to recapture, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Buber caused a storm by writing a book on Christianity, on Paul and Jesus, and Buber speaking of my brother Jesus. What a tremendous storm it caused the Jewish community. He must have sold out to the enemy. How could one use that language about this figure who to most Jews was a fearsome and frightful image of all that had been inflicted on Jews for 2,000 years? Or Franz Rosenzweig, who in the course of a rediscovery of himself as a Jew became one of the great, if not the greatest Jewish philosopher of the 20th century. And Rosenzweig himself had seriously considered conversion to Christianity before he decided instead to become a Jew, that is to say, to rediscover his own tradition. And Rosenzweig therefore could not dismiss Christianity, and so came up with a profound and important theology of two covenants, of God having through covenant called human beings, and seeing Christianity as the way, God's way through history, through the covenant, and Israel as the group or the religion that is with God at all times throughout history. And in Rosenzweig's image, trying to find room for both religions, he spoke of Christianity as the religion that goes out to change the world, and Judaism as a religion that's removed from history, and that lives as a kind of a waiting community that stands before God at all times. Rosenzweig, of course, meant well, but again did not understand that he was on the brink, Judaism was on the brink of a major revolution in which it was about to come back into history. For in the Holocaust, Jews discovered they could not be passive. And after the Holocaust, Jews overwhelmingly decided they must go back into history, build a state, and take responsibility for their faith. So Rosenzweig meant well, an important model, and yet in a way did not do justice to Judaism. And if I had to reflect back on Buber, I would say Buber meant well. I think his courage deserves great credit. And yet, paradoxically, he did not do justice to Christianity. Because when you look at Buber's presentation of Christianity, it turns out to be this wonderful religion in which Jesus, as a kind of a Jewish prophet, a Jewish dissident, Jewish innovator, let's face it, a kind of a Jewish Martin Buber, tries to recapture the mystical and the free revelation of God's presence. And it's a wonderful viewpoint, except that it's ruined by that fellow Paul who takes it and turns it into Christianity. It turns out that the Christianity that Buber admires deeply resembles suspiciously the Judaism that Buber admires deeply, and that both have in common that they reject the official positions of both religions. So, while Buber was trying, I would say, to rediscover Christianity, we can say that his vision still basically summarizes much of what Jews thought of Christianity in the 20th century. I said before, up till the 20th century, the basic Jewish attitude was the persecuting, hateful religion. In the 20th century, Jews became very tolerant and very understanding as America exposed us to each other. And so we came up with this wonderful new formulation. Christianity is a great religion, and there's so many good Jewish ideas in it. The question is, therefore, where we go from here in the encounter. And I'd like to suggest, briefly, that there are alternate models of relationship and alternate models of understanding that may serve us even more powerfully in the coming period. And I want to start from the beginning. What do Judaism and Christianity have in common more than anything else? I believe one could say that both religions' central message that they truly have in common is the teaching that we're living in a world in which we will see the triumph of life. I think more than anything else, that is the central teaching of both religions. Hear me out. What I mean by that is that this world is grounded in God, or created by God, depending on which theological language you use. And God is an infinite source of life, of goodness, and of power. And therefore, but this is the critical affirmation, not even just God, but therefore, because we have an infinite source of life and goodness and power, the world that we're living in will someday be the scene of the total triumph of life. And that means that the life which once never existed, there was a time when there was no life in this world, that life has emerged. That life has developed more and more. The highest form of life is the human being, who according to both traditions, according to the biblical tradition, is in the image of God. Life has developed such power, such freedom, such consciousness, such value, that it truly can be compared to God. We are an image of God. And as the rabbis interpreted this, if every human being is an image of God, it means we're becoming more and more like God. It means that human being is that form of life that is thus far the most powerful, the most free, the most conscious, the most valuable. But in fact, before history is done, life will totally triumph. And that means that every human being in the image of God, by right, by innate dignity, say the rabbis, have infinite value. Every human being is equal, because every image of God is equal to every other image. Every human being is unique, because there is no one image of God. Each image is unique. But, say the rabbis, and says the tradition, and says, I believe, both Judaism and Christianity, this is the most remarkable statement of all, that this truth, that life will win out, and this truth of the infinite value and equality and uniqueness of every person will someday be realized in this world. That's what's so remarkable about the statement. Because we're living in a world which is marked by degradation and cruelty and suffering. Since we sat down this evening to have dinner, and since I began to speak, how many children in Ethiopia have died of hunger, who could have been kept alive by $1 worth of food, or $2, but the $2 was not provided for them? We're living in a world in which oppression, organized oppression, in the form of totalitarian systems, in the form of apartheid and discrimination, exists all over. And yet the Jewish and Christian traditions teach that in this world we will see the final transformation in which the truth of the value of life will be accomplished. Do you realize what that means? In order for this dream to be realized, we would have to overcome hunger and poverty. We would have to overcome oppression and war. We would have to overcome sickness. And yes, we would have to overcome death itself. That is the ultimate logic of the Jewish covenant, that we would have to overcome death itself. For what is more degrading of human value than death itself, which takes somebody I loved infinitely, somebody had all the qualities of life, and turns them into something that molders and disintegrates and is gone. So the ultimate logic of a world created and grounded in God, which will be redeemed, is that we overcome hunger, poverty, war, sickness, and death itself. That is the ultimate logic of Judaism. That is what Isaiah says when he speaks of death will be swallowed up in eternity, and the Lord God will wipe all tears of all cheeks. That was the common patrimony of Judaism and Christianity when Christianity grew. In fact, just to underscore the point one step further, the ultimate logic of Judaism is not just that we will overcome death, but that to stop death in the future is only half the accomplishment. For those of you who want to settle right now, I know I have the same feeling. But that's only half the accomplishment. The ultimate logic would be not just that we will overcome future death. The ultimate logic of Judaism was that there never should have been death in the first place. And therefore the central teaching of Judaism, or one of the central theological teachings of Judaism in the first century, was indeed that death will be overcome retrospectively, namely resurrection will be accomplished. The fundamental hope of Judaism will express itself in resurrection. This was the common faith of the Jewish people in the first century when Jesus began his career. But I have to add one more footnote. What I have described to you, to overcome hunger and poverty and war and death, so I take a quick poll, how many of you believe this is going to happen? Take a quick poll. In this world. Mr. Gill, we got left? Morris, good guts. Good. I think about how many of you believe that we're going to accomplish all those things in this world? I think a quick poll. See that? Oh, ye of little faith. Well, if you're a Jew, I presume everybody in this room is either Jew or Christian. If you're a Jew, that's what your religion teaches. Now, let me, however, add at least this footnote. I'm glad I added the footnote, since obviously most of you are very skeptical. Judaism is a very reasonable and realistic religion. So when I said we're going to overcome hunger, poverty, war, death, and oppression, I meant it. Now, how do we do this realistically is even greater genius. And that's the other half of the coin. How are we going to accomplish this? This is meant to be literal, by the way. But we're going to accomplish this, says Judaism, not by a miraculous gift of God alone. That will not happen. Nor will it happen by renouncing this world and escaping to the world to come, although Rabbinic Judaism believes in the world to come. Nor will it happen by yielding the illusions of this life and turning to nirvana. It's going to happen by a program which is best described as covenant. It's going to happen by and through covenant. Now what does covenant mean? We have a contract, a partnership between the divine and the human. And that partnership is going to accomplish all the goals I described to you. In other words, it will not be bestowed upon us. It's going to happen through human agents in partnership with God. Now, what does that mean through human agents? It means on a human scale. The human scale means one step at a time. You all look skeptical because you thought I was promising you that tomorrow morning there'll be no more war. No. Or that I will overcome death. But why should you be so skeptical? When the first Jew, Abraham, was born, what was the average life expectancy in the late Babylonian Empire of the 18th century BCE? No one knows for sure, no censuses, but the best estimate is the upper 20s was the average lifespan. And now in this country, in this blessed country, in the year 1987, what's the average lifespan? It's about 80. For women, it's about 81, 82. Well, I figure After 3,500 years, we've tripled the life expectancy. At the present rate of tripling every 3,500 years, how long will it take till we live forever? Not very long. See, you were thinking much too narrowly. You laugh, but think of poverty as the fate. When we sat down, they laughed when I sat down to play the piano. Remember that advertisement? When Abraham started with the promise of freedom, 90% of the world was slave. By now, not only has slavery been abolished in most countries, but even dictatorships have to use the language of freedom. That's how powerful these ideas are and how they spread, generation by generation. Why do they have to call it the Chinese People's Democratic Republic when it was a dictatorship of Mao Zedong? Because by now the idea of freedom is so widespread that even those who don't have it have to make believe they're giving it to others. So one step at a time, that's the covenantal way. Do you want to achieve eternal life? Start by extending life, cure one disease, improve public health, raise the standard of living, improve exercise. There's thousands you can do, and little by little we'll extend life. Do you want to overcome hunger? Increase agricultural productivity. Think of how much of the world today does have food compared to the past. One step at a time, and I mean one step at a time. The covenantal way is one step at a time. The Exodus, the central liberating event of the Bible, took place the day after the Exodus. The Torah sought to quantify. Now that we know all human beings are entitled to absolute freedom, how do we go about establishing a free society? Look at chapter 22 of Exodus. The answer, chapter 21 of Exodus. The answer the Bible gives is that now that we've agreed all humans are entitled to be free, now what's the next step? Let's start the process right now. And the process starts, from now on, you can have a Hebrew slave no more than 6 years. Doesn't sound very noble, does it? But you know something? That's the process that started. You know how long it took to get the Hebrew slave owners to agree to let the slaves go free after 6 years? It took 8-9 centuries. But they didn't stop there. Having taken the first step, they then said, now that you let them go after 6 years, how do you treat them during the 6 years? How about shortening the hours? How about improving the pay? How about improving the working conditions? In fact, that took centuries more. But step by step, they got to the point where they finally abolished slavery. And that covenantal process, one step at a time, but you never quit, is the secret and most remarkable statement of Judaism and of Christianity. The covenantal notion. One step at a time, using human models, a human scale. A human model is an Abraham or a Sarah or a Moses. A human model is a David. He's not a superhuman being. He's capable of all the sins of the flesh, of lust and of adultery and of murder. And yet he has a human capacity to turn and correct himself and do better. So if you don't stop, if you develop human models, and if you work at it generation after generation, and I come to the final point obviously, if you don't make it in your lifetime, you don't stop. What you do is you have children, and you pass on the covenantal vision to them, and they will carry it on. And if each generation will make its contribution, and if nobody will quit along the way, then someday the world will be totally transformed. You see, you were thinking narrowly when you were so skeptical. You were thinking, in my lifetime, what are the odds? But your lifetime doesn't start when you're born, nor does it end when you die. Because before you die, the light of your life sets the candle of somebody else's life. Or the vision of your religious redemption is transmitted to somebody else who lives on after you. And if we keep the process going, someday life will be transformed and perfected. Now that brings me, of course, to Judaism and Christianity. What is Judaism in its own self-image? It's one people, one group trying to set out a model of teaching these views and then showing the living community how you carry it out. And as a group of people to work for this final redemption. But Judaism's own self-image is it's not going to stop with the Jews. It may start with the Jews, but it can't stop with the Jews, because all human beings are the image of God. And therefore this vision must be transmitted to the whole world, not just to the Jewish people. All Judaism teaches you is, start with your own people. Start with your own family. Do you want to save the whole world? Do you want to save humanity? Okay. Do you want a humanity in which nobody shall go hungry? It's a brilliant idea. You want to accomplish it? Start with your own brother. Start with your own cousin. Treat them like they're entitled not to be hungry. That means take your own money and give it to them, not as a favor, because you owe it to them. That's what tzedakah means, you owe it to them. And in this process of starting with your own immediate family, widen out to your own cousins, to your own distant cousins, and keep going. If you keep going, you know what you'll discover? Every human being is at maximum an 86th cousin to every other human being. So ultimately, the whole world will be transformed. And until it happens, we're not to settle. And just to make sure we get there, God has promised us there will be a Redeemer who will help us. This was the state of Judaism in the first century when Jesus began his career. A period of oppression and suffering, in which he came as a teacher, as a model. Again, everything I say is obviously controversial because there'll never be an agreed upon one view. And yet clearly, his message was the kingdom of God is at hand. His message was that the redemptive moment is here. His message was this transformation of the world we've spoken about is about to happen. Now we all know what actually happened. The Romans were not overthrown. The Jews were not redeemed, at least not politically. And in fact, Jesus himself was destroyed, crucified in the most degrading possible death, a symbol of an outcast and of a criminal, or of a revolutionary, or both. Now here I come to the point, however. In this moment of truth, when his hopes, at least as understood by any Jew would be, were dashed, because the promise of overcoming hunger and poverty and oppression is dashed, and this very person being destroyed by the enemy, by the evil one. His own followers, or at least some of them, did not lose hope and did not lose faith. Now, again, for 1800 years, no Jew could say what I'm about to say. I don't mean this because I'm so great, but rather because we couldn't afford the luxury of debating this question. But in retrospect, if I was talking about a Jew who went through a great tragedy and continued to believe after the tragedy, I would admire this. We as Jews have learned repeatedly, when the temple was destroyed, instead of giving up hope and faith, we remained faithful. Then one can begin to admire the faithfulness of Jesus' immediate followers, all of them Jewish, by the way, who instead of losing hope and giving up, said the death of this does not prove anything. They remain trusting and hopeful. In fact, they remained faithful to what they understood as vision. And then what happened? Well, as they understood it, why did he die? Well, possibly he sacrificed himself. It's a world of great evil and suffering, and the sacrifice was needed. That's a very Jewish model. Or possibly they understood that this very destruction is teaching a deeper lesson. That the redemption we expected was not a political redemption, it was a spiritual redemption. That the kingdom of God is within you. And that in fact, even though we have only spiritual redemption, that's the redemption that counts. Now, up to this point, I would say everything that I've described to you is eminently Jewish. Remaining faithful in the face of suffering, believing that redemption is coming, even believing that redemption is spiritual. Judaism believes in spiritual redemption as well. I don't think a single step is an error with the following qualification. The same Christians, they were not yet Christians, of course, as they taught in the Jewish community, did not get very far, for obvious reasons. The Jews kept, first of all, most of the Jews didn't even hear them in the first place. And even if they heard them, their reaction was, but the Messiah is supposed to transform the world. Look around you. Is the world full of evil and suffering and death yet? Obviously, the Messiah hasn't come yet. And the Christian discovery that while Jews weren't listening, more and more non-Jews were listening. And even more crushing, when the temple was destroyed in that very same century, and 60 years later, when the Jews tried to recover their temple and were again destroyed, from a Christian perspective, what they concluded was, obviously God has rejected the Jews. And obviously, by not listening to Jesus, they have forfeited their covenant. And we are the inheritors, not of the old covenant alone, but we are the new covenant which replaces the old. That, in essence, was the Christian interpretation of what had happened in the first century. And if it wasn't so clear in the first century, Christianity went on to become the biggest success story you could imagine. It became a worldwide religion. So if it wasn't that way in the first century, by the 5th century or by the 15th, when it was a worldwide success, this became the Christian interpretation. Now, was there an alternate interpretation? I would respectfully submit that there was, even for Christians. But let me take a moment to describe the Jewish interpretation of what I just described to you from the Christian perspective. The Jewish interpretation was, what's going on here? This man came, promised to be the Messiah or to bring the Messiah, or both. Totally failed. Okay, that makes sense. It's not the first, not the last time. It's neither the first nor the last time that a Messiah came to Jews and proved to be a false Messiah. And in fact, to be a Jew is to believe in every Messiah that comes and hope this is the Messiah. And it so happens to the false one, so wait for the next one. So from the Jewish point of view, that was understandable. Here's another would-be Messiah, didn't make it. But how do you explain the fact that this Messiah didn't make it, but his religion went on to become the world's most successful? It spread throughout the whole world and reached hundreds of millions of people. Well, of course, Judaism developed tactics too. The Christian explanation, when they were asked, if you're so wonderful, so successful, how come the Jews didn't accept you? After all, this is a religion that grows out of Judaism. So the Christians had a bunch of explanations. The Jews are blind. The Jews are deaf spiritually. The Jews are children of the devil. The Jews have been upheld by the devil to resist Jesus. I mean, these are all friendly interpretations designed to explain for Christians why Jews never accept Christianity. But Jews had the same problem reversed. Why is Christianity so successful? And to give you a short summary, it's hard to do justice, take 800 years in 5 minutes. Jews developed counterpart interpretations. Well, frankly, the most important one was obvious. Christianity spread among Gentiles, not among Jews. Because only a Goyish Akab could believe in Christianity. And that's the most honest answer. What can I say? That God will become flesh, that this will be a virgin birth. If you believe that, you believe anything. That, in essence, was the Jewish understanding. And frankly, again, not totally unreasonable. Most of the Christian triumphalism then was met by a counterpart kind of contempt that said, for people who don't know any better, and again, I don't want to be totally unfair, both sides had occasional exceptions. And on the Jewish side, particularly since there's a tradition that Jews are not the only carriers of redemption, there was a willingness to say, well, Christianity, it's okay as a religion as long as it doesn't persecute us. Most of the time it does persecute us. But it's okay as a religion with the qualification that it's got some good Jewish ideas, which I help with. But someday the Christians will wake up and realize the truth, which is that the Jewish ideas were better before they mixed in all this other stuff. And when they discover it, we'll all live happily ever after. And I know it's uncomfortable to say these things, but my test of we're really open in America is to be honest with each other. That's how the two religions lived together for 1,800 years. And again, I don't apologize to the Jew for saying what I said about Christianity, because the other side was much worse. Because supersessionism turned into why you're still alive. If we don't deserve to still be existing, why are we still existing? The answer is we don't deserve to exist. Then there were 3 Christian strategies, since we don't deserve to exist. One was to say, stop existing. Kill them. Another way was to say, stop existing, kick them out of the country. And the third way was to say, you're alive, you don't really exist. You're a fossil. You're a child of the devil. So from that point of view, Jews have a lot less to apologize for. But those were the only options we were locked into for 1,800 years. Now we know those options are no longer tolerable. So what alternative do I have to propose? I would propose that the discovery of each other as human beings, which paved the way for this new understanding between us, now be taken seriously theologically. Let's look at the first century again. If we look at it not from the Jewish perspective, and not from the Christian perspective, let's try to look at it from God's perspective for a moment. Notice the modesty of my assumption that I can give you God's perspective. Let's look at it from God's perspective for a moment. If you were the God of the covenant, the God who wanted human beings to participate in their own redemption, the God who wanted the world to be transformed, the God who wanted people to know that every human being is in the image of God, but who wanted human models to show human ways of achieving these goals. what would be a great way of, now that you've got the Jews living up to the covenant, of expanding this insight? One way might be to say everybody should become Jewish. But first of all, that could be pretty boring if everybody became Jewish, I would think. Although Jews are less boring than most people because they all fight each other. But still, when you think about it, it would be kind of boring. And why should everybody have to become Jewish? Maybe we could work out some way of the whole world becoming covenantal without becoming Jewish. Well, how would you do that? You'd have to start within Judaism, because only the Jews would be expecting a Messiah, and only the Jews would be expecting the resurrection as a signal of the Messiah. So it would have to start among the Jews. And the Jews had this covenantal idea anyway. But if you sent the signal through the Jews, and the reason the Jews didn't follow the signal is not because they were deaf and blind, it's because they weren't supposed to. Because they were being faithful to their covenant, so why should they hear the signal? The signal is intended for people who don't have the covenant. So you send the signal through the Jewish people that the Jews don't hear, not because they don't hear, but because this is not their signal. The true faithful one responds to the signal that's sent to them. So since the Jews don't accept the signal, as they're not supposed to, others will accept the signal. You now transmute from the Jews to the rest of the world. How do you do that? Had the Jews accepted it, you might have been tempted to say it stays in the family. Since the Jews don't accept it, you say we no longer follow the family model. Judaism is a family model. It's Abraham's family. Now you open up a different concept, a non-biological community, a community of faithful believers, believers in Jesus. In short, if this was God's strategy, it was brilliant. It worked. The Jews did their thing they were supposed to do, which is to stay faithful to their covenant, and a handful of them split off and brought the covenant to the rest of the world. Now here I want to say, since we're thinking of new ideas and new approaches, that a leading Christian theologian who has been exploring many of these same issues has suggested an alternate model. I'm suggesting that's what God had in mind in the first place. But Paul Van Buren, in his most recent work on the Jewish-Christian dialogue, Paul Van Buren, a Protestant theologian, has argued that that's putting too much on God. That if the covenant is understood properly, that maybe the covenant has an important role for human beings. And let me give you the Jewish example. When the temple was destroyed, the very event that Christians interpreted as the finish of Judaism, was Judaism finished? Quite the contrary. Along came the rabbis who taught that the temple was destroyed not because God has rejected the Jews, but because God wants the Jews to become more active in the religion, a higher level of partnership. If the temple is destroyed, if we've lost the priests and the sacrifices, said the rabbis, God has become more hidden. Then when God was visible, God was in the temple. Now that God is hidden, God can be found all over the world. So the rabbis taught us that we can worship God all over the world and build a synagogue anywhere in the world. When God was visible, God spoke through prophets, thus saith the Lord. And God gave messages directly in the temple. Now that God has become more hidden, God doesn't send prophets anymore. So human beings must study the Word of God, and so we developed the rabbis, people who do not speak directly from God, but who study God's Word, and who teach us how to apply it in everyday life. In short, the destruction of the temple in the rabbis' model was a call to Jews and to human beings to take a more active role in the realization of the covenant. I would submit to you, this is Van Buren's model, that the killing of Jesus was God's signal to his disciples not to abandon him and not to reject the Jewish people, but to take up responsibility for bringing his message to the rest of the world. Therefore, Van Buren suggests it was the faithfulness of the followers, their hermeneutic, their explanation of Jesus' death as a call to life, that they presented not only to the world, but to God, who found it acceptable and gave it a blessing. So you might say that both religions, in a way, accomplish remarkable things. Judaism taught us for 1,800 years not only how to be faithful to the covenant, but how to suffer powerlessness and oppression and pariah status and not lose our dignity. Judaism taught us how you can suffer the worst of human experience and yet remain full of hope and show a model of humane human concern. You can create a community in which truly the poor are your flesh and blood. Before our very eyes, at this past year, at a time when we saw those children starving in Ethiopia, and no one lifted a finger. We saw a Jewish community so well trained by 3,000 years of covenant that its young men risked their lives to fly into Sudan and save same black Ethiopian children, fly them to Israel, where Jews around the world raised millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to give these people dignity of a full life and a new start in life at a very moment that the blacks of the same color, skin, race, and location die because their life isn't worth a few dollars. So here was a remarkable accomplishment of 1,800 years of covenantal life. And Christianity accomplished some remarkable things in the 1,800 years also. It brought the consoling, healing word of God and a promise of a future life and a promise of a final redemption to humanity. Remarkable achievements. I would argue that both religions then accomplished remarkable things, and both religions mistakenly thought that their own accomplishment means that the other one must be wrong. For Christians thought if God has called us, if Jesus had this incredible resurrection, and the Jews didn't follow, we must be right and they must be wrong. And Jews became convinced that the very triumphalism of Christianity proves that Jesus is a false Messiah. I would argue that Jews today can look at Jesus again, not as a false Messiah, but as a failed Messiah. It's an important difference. A false Messiah means wrong values. Like Shabtai Tzvi, the would-be Messiah of the 17th century, who taught sin and crime when he could not change the world. But Jesus as a failed Messiah simply means a Messiah who comes to bring the final resolution and does not bring it. You should know that a century after Jesus, Bar Kokhba was a failed Messiah. Rabbi Akiva and great rabbis supported him as a Messiah. He failed. He didn't bring the final redemption, but he's not treated as an outcast. He is treated as a good attempt that didn't make it all the way. So from a Jewish point of view, I would argue even the word failure is a false word. If you think about it, Moses was a failure too. He tried to make the Jewish people free, but the generation that he liberated died in the desert. He wanted the Jews to get to the promised land and never made it. So the truth is the word failure is a false term anyway. It means not yet redeemed. But most Christians have come to see that despite Jesus' recognition and arrival, the world is not yet fully redeemed. And if we didn't know it before, we know it after the Holocaust. So that in fact, I would argue that both religions can, with integrity, reformulate their own message and yet drop the negative images of the other. And I want to finish with that simple point. That if we think of it in this perspective, what is possible? First of all, what's possible is that each religion can accept the other in its fullness. Jews can come to see that Christianity is not only a good religion because it has liberal, ethical, and Jewish values, but even the other side of Christianity, the faithful, traditional side, the side of those dogmas we find so incomprehensible, also has enormous power. And one of the ways you recognize the dignity of somebody else is to let them define their own religion, rather than defining them for them. One has to come to see that even those shorthand, easy images we've used to dismiss Christians do not do justice to Christianity. Let me give a personal example. I said earlier, I grew up with this image of Christianity as the unreasonable saintliness. Judaism is a reasonable religion. It affirms family. Its models of perfection are in the family. Judaism stresses a moderation and a responsibility for daily life, whereas Christianity, it seemed to me, for many years, had gone off in a very extreme way, making total demands, asking its priests for celibacy, asking its people to take up the cross and follow Christ. What an exaggerated image of perfection, saintliness. So personal experience. In 1974, I had the privilege of participating in a world dialogue of world religions in Sri Lanka. By the way, sponsored by the World Council of Churches, and that was an important lesson for me, that they were willing to spend the energy and the time to bring my views and other religious views to their own people. During the break, during the conference, they took us for a walk. Took us to a nearby village, which was an extraordinary religious experience for all of us. It was a village in which a group of Western people from Norway had come to Sri Lanka to create a little village to take care of brain-damaged children. They told me that before this village came, parents used to leave these children to die because it was a struggling, poverty-stricken society. It was hard enough to take care of even healthy children. These were children, most of whom were brain damaged and could not even respond well to treatment. And here I was astonished to discover was a group that turned out to be a Christian group. The leader, a man who had given up a brilliantly successful career as a media figure because he had been inspired by this religious vision of taking up the cross, of following Christ, taking up the cross, had gone off 5,000 miles to Sri Lanka, to some backwoods village, where he created a community that took care of brain-damaged children. Now, they took us through the house where the children lived. Almost all the children lay there. That's all they could do. They would sit, some sat, some lay there. They moaned. They occasionally looked at you. And they were taken care of. Many of them could not control bodily functions. And they were constantly taken care of and wiped and cleaned. It was the most stunning religious experience one can imagine. I said to myself, here are people who lived a life of ease and of comfort and of recognition, like I live. And they had voluntarily gone thousands of miles to a totally strange place, not to do one incredible act of heroism, give their life, but to spend the rest of their lives, day in, day out, 24 hours a day, serving children who, if you took care of them and took care of them well, they looked at you and they moaned. That was the reward you got. And the press didn't come to cover you. It was a mind-boggling experience of saintliness. And I thought to myself that all these years of triumphalism, what I have boasted about is that my own faith and my own ethical system accepted people in normal functions, affirmed the significance of normal life and of family. And that triumphalism had blinded me to the incredible power of a religion that was prepared to make an absolute demand for saintliness on its people that could inspire that kind of a religious response. So the shorthand stereotypes we use of the other may be the source of their strength. How many times have Christians put down Jews as a carnal religion? A religion of deeds and a religion that's carnal, it's too physical. It emphasizes family, it emphasizes food, it emphasizes the pleasures of this world. That's a standard Christian put down of Judaism. But in fact, it's the greatness of Judaism. Because in fact, it takes daily life and makes it holy. That in fact, it does involve this kind of responsibility of actions and not just words. In short, what I'm trying to say is that each religion will discover that its own weaknesses grow out of its failure to understand the other. And that maybe in retrospect, this is what God had in mind in the first place. The truth is, each religion is a human way, a human participation in the covenant of the divine. But if it's a human way, there can be no one way. If we want to develop ethical loyalty out of family responsibility, the genius of Judaism, the strength of that is also the weakness. You feel closer to your own family. How about a religion that would stress a universal rather than a family relationship? Well, if you need both, then you've got to have Judaism and Christianity. But if we had only Christianity with its emphasis on the brotherhood of the believers, we would not understand the enormous power of family, the people of God. And it's interesting that Christianity, since Vatican II particularly, has become fascinated by is exploring this very notion of the people of God, because it's come to see there's a power of responsibility and solidarity in peoplehood that you don't have when you just define yourself as a faith of belief. In short, I would argue that each religion, to meet its own goals, needs the insights of the other. We need the particularism of Judaism, its location in one state, in one piece of land, to make us appreciate the tactility of human experience. We need the spiritualization of Christianity. But the spiritualization of Christianity alone leads Christianity to the failure of abandoning this world to Caesar and to Mammon. It leads Christianity to put down the importance of this world and become the opium of the masses that encourages the masses to accept oppression instead of fighting it. So Christianity needs the corrective of the Hebrew Scriptures and of the Jewish carnality, just as the Jewish carnality needs and welcomes the insight of Christian spiritualization. Because the truth is, we need each other and the wholeness that alone makes possible the ultimate redemption. So where do we stand today? I would argue at the very beginning of an incredible breakthrough. the evil, the suffering, the power of evil that we have seen in the Holocaust taught the Jewish people that they are called to a new level of responsibility for the covenant. Jews are called, as they have come to understand it, to ensure that the dreams of the covenant are realized and that Jews have to take power and take responsibility. It's that that led us to establish the State of Israel. It's that that led us to a whole new outburst of life and creativity both in Israel and America. It's that has led us Jews to reassert our dignity as Jews, to stop hiding in the woodwork, to start asserting our own particularity and our pride at being Jewish, and our rediscovery of our Jewish way. I believe the same lesson of the Holocaust, of the power of evil, that leads us to take power for our own fate, is something that the whole world now seeks to discover. Why did Elie Wiesel get the Nobel Prize? Was it not a statement there of the world concerned by the tremendous power in the hands of evil, including the power to destroy the world, that wanted the reassurance of the model, of the covenantal model of a people that can survive and renew life and renew hope and love? I would argue, therefore, that these models of taking power are not just Jewish models. They are the central question of Christianity now, which seeks in liberation theology in the Third World, which seeks in its new theology of peoplehood to recover the this worldly responsibilities of religion. And the truth is, as much as Christians talk about the finality of Christ, any Christian with integrity will admit to you that the world is not yet redeemed. And therefore, on some level, that is a tacit admission of the ongoing truth of the Jewish claim, that the Messiah has not yet finally arrived. So again, we need not choose between our own loyalties. I believe what is possible now is a new Judaism that affirms its own past and tradition without basing it on the negative interpretation of Christians. And a Christianity, a new Christian understanding, that bases its own integrity on recovery of its Jewishness and recovery of its appreciation for Jews and Judaism without having to put it down. Christianity's hope of not being a gospel of hate, but a gospel of love, is dependent on Christianity's breakthrough in overcoming its relationship to Judaism of the past and creating a new reality. So I submit to you that 1,800 years, 1,900 years after the destruction of the temple, and 1,900 plus years after the crucifixion of Jesus, that both religions now face the possibility of giving up their self-defined claims, of giving up their claim not to be the instruments of God, not giving up their claim to be models of covenantal living, but to give up what I would consider to be the secondary and false interpretations, the one that say that I must be right. If God loves me, if God has chosen me, then I must be right and the other's wrong. Maybe the answer is that God has enough love to love more than once. That God has enough love. What parent hasn't had the experience of loving each child absolutely, of loving each child differently and yet infinitely at the same time? Let us give God that credit, that God could love and choose and signal again and again without rejecting one in favor of the other. And let us give humans the credit that giving up the stereotypes and the put-downs and the guaranteed monopoly of truth and salvation, that they will rise to higher levels, that they are able to be inspired by the humanity and the dignity and the uniqueness of the other spiritual life and learn from it instead of rejecting it. What an incredible adventure to be embarking on, that after 1,900 years we truly can prove together that the time has come now for the triumph of life. We are living in the age of the greatest breakthroughs of all time, of power, of freedom, of consciousness. What an opportunity for Jews and Christians together to show that it's really possible that all those lies we've been telling for 1,900 years are true. You know, the story of the gentleman who goes to Israel after raising money for Israel for 25 years, never went to Israel in his life. Finally, they send him off. He comes back from the mission very excited. They have the annual dinner for UJA. They're all wondering, what will he say? He gets up very excited and he says, friends, remember for 25 years I'm raising money for Israel? Well, I finally got to go to Israel. Everybody leans forward. He says, you know, all those lies I've been telling Israel for 25 years, they're true. I submit to you that all those lies we've been telling the world for 2,000 years and in Jews' for 3,000 years. There's a God who cares, that human beings have infinite value, that humans have the power to literally take command of life, to transform life, to overcome hunger and poverty and oppression, through medicine to overcome sickness and yes, death, that those lies we've been teaching for 20 are true. They're in our hands. And that we have been called by our covenantal partner to challenge everything in our past and our tradition that puts down the other, to overcome these barriers, not to disappear in each other's love, not to give up our uniqueness, but in discovering each other's uniqueness, to join together as a model to the world. You know, the standard put down of religion is that in the Middle Ages, when religion was strong, there were all these terrible religious wars. And modern society made possible tolerance and pluralism. But the truth is that the modern world is pluralist and tolerant about religion when religion doesn't matter. When the things that really count, like economics and politics, come in, we have mass murder in the modern world too. And when religion still matters, there's mass murder for religion in the modern world. So I propose that in fact what the modern world needs is models of committed pluralism, of a religious depth and passion, and following God, following God and following our commitments to the covenantal ways of Judaism and Christianity, to at the very same time and of deep passion affirm each other and discover each other. That model would truly prove to the world that it's possible to have the triumph of life, that love can be stronger than hatred. That model which we are now beginning to explore is the great adventure of this generation of Jews and Christians.
Rabbi Greenberg will take questions now, and I will take the mic and try to give voice if necessary.
Rabbi Greenberg, I, Milton Richmond Rabbi, cannot talk as plainly about God as you do. I'd rather start talking about the human situation because I don't know that God cared. I don't know what God wanted. I don't know what God's will is. I'd rather ask a different question, or at least put it in another way. What is our human situation now? What do we need? You and I know about the death of God thought. You and I know about the post-Christian period. You and I know about the post-Holocaust period. So let's talk about the human situation. What's bringing Christians and Jews together? Is it they suddenly seem alike? Have they really? Isn't it rather that the secular world, the communist world, the power structure is forcing us to be together? Because as you said at the end, religion it reigns, but it doesn't rule. It has no real power. Why don't we address ourselves to the question that though we are separate and equal, as you seem to posit, the nuclear war may destroy us all, whatever God says.
It's a very challenging question, and I appreciate the integrity of a rabbi asking it all the more so. I would rephrase your question in this way. I think one of the great profound truths of the Bible, which Christianity was tempted to abandon, and which I think Judaism in the Middle Ages also began to abandon, is that as long as human beings are oppressed and hungry and suffering and degraded, then there really isn't faith in God. There is verbal faith in God. There are words about God, but on some level they remain words, not real. Not until the world is transformed and every human being is an image of God and hunger is overcome and so on, will there truly be knowledge of God. Very powerful rabbinic midrash. When Moses is called to go to the Jewish people, he says, God says to him, Ushmi Hashem, tell the Jewish people, I am the God who appeared to your ancestors, your fathers, but Ushmi Hashem lo nodati lahem, by my name Adonai, I was not known to them. All the Jewish commentators ask, but the name Adonai is known in the book of Bereshit, in the first book of the Bible. To which the rabbis answered, of course they knew it verbally, But the name Adonai means the loving God, the God who cares, the God who is with you. When you're enslaved, you may know that verbally, but you don't know it. When you're a slave, then you can't really know that God truly loves you. You may feel God's love gives you some consolation, but you don't feel the full love until you are truly free. So what you're saying to us, our Richmond, is that you can't separate the theological from the human condition. And therefore, I would accept that 100%, that the real challenge to both religions is to join and participate in the work of making the human situation one that is compatible with truly a God who cares. How can you say there's a God who cares when Jewish children were burnt alive before our very eyes in the Holocaust and no one lifted a finger? How can you say there's a God who cares when a child or an adult is dying of cancer and there's nothing to do for them? The answer is you can say it at best gingerly, with an apology, with embarrassment. And the only time you can truly affirm God fully is when God and the human condition are no longer separate, when the human condition is fully dignified. And by the way, let me reverse that for a minute. I, as a Jew, for many years dismissed the notion of God suffering because that was so Christian. We're all God on the cross, God suffering, that appeared to be so Christian. It's not until I confronted the fullness of the Holocaust that I realized to myself that that's exactly what the Talmud meant. That's exactly what Jewish tradition meant when it said God shares the suffering of human beings. That far from being a Christian idea, it's central to Jewish, and if I wasn't so busy putting down Christianity, I would have come to see that. Because where else would God be but where human beings are suffering? So that again, these easy Jewish stereotypes that Christianity is the God suffering do an injustice to the truth of God's sharing of the human experience. And if you want to, here I offer a Jewish insight back to Christians in gratitude for their helping me see my own best tradition. The other side of the coin is liberate humans and you liberate God. The real message of the Holocaust for Christians, I would argue, is that nobody should be on the cross. If you reread the New Testament story in light of the Holocaust, what stands out to me in rereading the crucifixion story now is that when Jesus was put on the cross, that at least according to one version, he cracked. And if you take this as a Christian, as a religious Christian, it means that even God, as it were, on the cross, could not take the pain and finally said, God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you forsaken me? Which is a living lesson to all religious people that nobody should be put on the cross. And therefore the Christian challenge, like the Jewish challenge, the Christian challenge, to put in Christian terms, is to take people off the cross, or to make sure that nobody is put on the cross ever again. And that's the Jewish message. If we had a conflict with Father O'Connor in his response to Yad Vashem, it's about this issue. Cardinal O'Connor responded as a deeply moved Christian to the Yad Vashem by saying, suffering, how moved he was by it and what a gift this is to take that suffering and offer it to God. And he was speaking out of a profoundly true religious perspective. What he had failed to realize is that Jews had gone one step further on this theological way. And it concluded the lesson of the Holocaust was that the suffering should be stopped. And that even God on the cross is not right. It's too much even for God, let alone for human beings. So again, the insight should be drilled from each other rather than against each other. The only quarrel I would have with your question, not a quarrel, the only demurral I would offer would be that it's true that some of what brings us together is fear of secularization and fear of the enemies. But I hope in the long run that will not be the decisive element in our coming together for one reason. Because I fear that in order for Jews and Christians to come together, we should make Islam the bad guy. Or we should make the secularists the bad guy. There are many who propose, let there be an alliance of Jews and Christians against the secularists. But I think the lesson of the 20th century is that we should not set up the scapegoat and the other. We have to learn to love our own religion and to live it from within without the need to put down the other. So it may be true that we're afraid of the secularists or the Marxists as religious Jews or religious Christians, but I don't want to make that the motivation. I maintain that the real power of the present moment is the discovery of the dignity and uniqueness of each other. But we've got to work at it. Jews have got to drop a lot of the easy memories that put down Christianity. I don't say drop in the sense of forgetting them, but not use these stereotypes to avoid Christianity. And certainly Christians have a major challenge. It's right there in the heart of the New Testament. Some of the most ugly, degrading images of Jews in the world are found right there in the heart of the New Testament. It's a major job to confront those images and overcome them. So it's not just the human situation, it's also the theological situation that has to be worked on. I would like to emphasize the positive, but I fully recognize those dangers of the negative side. I believe together we can deal with both.
Rabbi Greenberg, as myself, as a post-Vatican II Roman Catholic, and I have a lot of Jewish friends, I'm intrigued, and I really appreciate your message. But I wonder, would you, given the vast diversity of human experience and human cultures all over the world, would you limit the divinity of human beings to two great religions?
Very important point. Did you hear that I said something? Yeah. The question basically was, am I saying, given the vast diversity of human experience, am I basically arguing that Jews and Christians have the divine revelation? What about all the other religions? No, I'm glad you asked the question, because I don't believe that only Jews and Christianity have the revelation or have been chosen. I think, again, one of the things we're discovering is that as we discover more and more encounter with other groups and other religions, we discover the power in their religious experience also. Now, Judaism and Christianity are uniquely related to each other. That's a painful truth which both sides are going to have to come to grips with. It was that closeness that led Christians to all those negative images of Jews, because they couldn't justify why the Jews remain Jewish when they're so close. And it's those same closeness that leads Jews to push away Christianity. So there is a special relationship, and I think both have a special connection to the covenantal idea. But first of all, Islam itself has also, in part, growing out of Judaism, and in part, in its own right, has developed a covenantal model. And even beyond the covenantal model, I think our task is to encounter every religion with openness and with the sense of the potential dignity and spiritual force of other groups and other religions. Having said that, I want, in other words, so I take the thrust of your question to be correct, and I affirm the fact that God cannot be contained or monopolized in any religious experience of any one group. Having said that, let me just make one corrective, because this is the classic problem of this position. Am I saying, therefore, that all religions are right? No, I'm not saying that, because I'm saying each religion is entitled to be listened to with full respect and dignity. Each value system has a right to present itself, but we have to make judgments. I have this struggle with my students all the time. Some of you may have seen an article that was published about 3 years ago in the New York Times. It was called Guilt-Free History, which is Harvard professor describing. He teaches modern European history. And in the true spirit of America, where we respect and love everybody, he said he found he was getting back rather striking papers. Some of the students would write, and then there was the SS, who ran the concentration camps, and the Jews. And of course, one can't make these judgments. The SS did their thing, and the Jews did their thing. Who am I to make judgments? So the danger becomes, when you say all religions have validity, does that mean we have no right to make judgments? I say no. That's part of what we're wrestling with in this new encounter. Can you develop a committed pluralism? Commitment means you make judgments. Therefore, each religion has to be judged. If there are religions that teach negative values or murder, that must be confronted. If there are religions that give us models of the divinity that are degrading, we have to confront this. So I'm not saying carte blanche, every religion is automatically right. What I'm saying is that each religion is entitled to be listened to, that we have to give up the automatic assumption that only our view is correct. But I believe we'll discover that this is the genius of the covenantal idea and of the chosenness idea. I've often thought, why is covenant so central to the biblical vision? I think what covenant is trying to tell us is that religion is ultimately not a doctrinal truth. If there's one doctrinal truth, then it's very hard to say there can be more than one. But if you think of religion not as a doctrinal truth, but as the way to God, in which humans are transformed by the divine and by their own activity, then obviously there are many ways in which humans are human. And as I said before, you can love each child uniquely, and you can live each life uniquely without denying or degrading the other. So I think in chosenness we have a model for an absolute commitment. I take it as an absolute commitment. It's not just a casual one. Secondly, one that is at the same time willing to admit there are other commitments, but is also willing to make judgments on them. So with that qualification, that we are not exempt, we don't want to say all views are right, but rather that all views are potentially right, and we must separate the good from the bad, the right from the wrong, and be prepared to make judgments and make criticism. Within that framework, I would affirm the truth of your central point, that we should not slip into Western ethnocentrism any more than to Jewish or Christian ethnocentrism, and we have to see that the infinite God that we worship, that infinite God who wants to be recognized in human and particularist ways, whether it be Jewish or Christian or anything else, that infinite God cannot be possessed by any one group. Even if that group has a profound truth and an absolute revelation, it cannot own God. And when you give up the monopoly, you haven't lost commitment. That's the confusion again. So once you get monopoly, you give up commitment. And that's why the fanatics are committed and the moderates somehow do it casually. We have to become as committed to our pluralism and our moderation as the fanatics are committed to their extremism. In that context, we will discover that there are many absolute commitments. Yes?
A night like tonight, you could help us speak of Jesus as a failed Messiah rather than as a false Messiah. And the Christian has the notion of a second coming.
Right.
And in a funny way,
They are very similar.
work towards redemption is not yet accomplished, and the Christian could hold out for the uniqueness of Jesus, and the Jew could hold out for the failed rather than false Messiah character of Jesus. Now, if you helped us out on Jesus, what are you going to do with Paul? Saul? Is there any that might be more difficult to talk about?
No, I thought I was getting at that in my presentation, but I'll make a very simple response that I can, not do justice to the complexity. When I say, by the way, again, I want to make clear, when I say Jesus a failed Messiah, that failure is a very complimentary term, in Jewish tradition, so it's not meant to be a put-down when I say that word. And you're correct in saying, is that not the counterpart of the Christian notion of second coming? What I like to put is that was a Christian tacit way of admitting the truth of Judaism's claim all along, that the Messiah isn't here yet. But I agree. Now the question of Paul. The point I was trying to make was, in the beginning of this encounter, Jews would accept Jesus in a new way, but only on their own terms, meaning that Jesus, the ethical Jewish prophet or the ethical Jewish teacher, with good Jewish ideas, yes, not the Christ of Paul's teaching, the Son of God or the Messiah of God incarnate or the vicarious atonement, all that stuff was dismissed by Jews as irrelevant or, misleading or irrational or dogmatic Hellenistic foolishness. The model I've offered tonight offers a much more constructive version. Now, up to now, I understand why. Because a Jew, if you believe in Jesus' resurrection, then they have to become a Christian, don't you? My answer is no. My answer is that Paul's interpretation of Jesus' life, in all the various forms, because there are many forms of interpretation, can be affirmed as the legitimate hermeneutic of that covenantal community. And that the divine has chosen to make that hermeneutic possible. Let me give an example of what I mean. Many Christian theologians, in their triumphalism vis-a-vis Judaism, have said, look, Christianity is true. Even someone like Pannenberg. Why? Because the resurrection is the ultimate proof that God has proved Christianity's truth. After all, the resurrection took place. You got to be a damn fool not to recognize the implications of this. So then most Jews had to answer, well, you can't, that Jesus wasn't resurrected. That's obviously the answer, because if he was resurrected, then we'd be damn fools not accepting it. But here along came Pinchas Lapida, a Jewish theologian in Israel, who said, why? Why do you have to assume, well, God might have resurrected Jesus in order to call the Gentiles to God's service? And that kind of a miracle would have really wowed the Gentiles. Jews wouldn't have been wowed until the whole world was resurrected, not just one person, but that's because we had been living with this for a longer time. But as a resurrection to call the Gentiles, why not? And Lapid argued that, in fact, God had done that. Now, it just gives us an example of a Jew who offers an interpretation that would affirm a classic Christian claim without giving up the commitment to being a Jew or the faithfulness to Jewish covenant. So Paul's whole interpretation of Jesus' life and Jesus' career would be seen as a legitimate hermeneutic, a divinely inspired interpretation designed to give Christianity the power and the depth, the religious depth that has developed over the course of its history. The only qualification I would make to that would be that, however, Paul is not necessarily the last word either. The covenantal model suggests that there are later further developments and insights that are possible. the one criticism I would offer of Paul's viewpoint is that it makes the Christian passive. So if God has come in flesh to save humanity, then this encourages passive human behavior. Because God is there in the flesh to do it for us. You see, the Jewish answer was, God has pulled back, you got to work harder. In a way, again, they're both very Jewish. Both religions have gotten together and said, look, there's a great gap between God and humans, right? A lot of evil in this world. How are we going to close this gap? So it's very Jewish to admit there are two partners, God and humans, that there is a gap, and you must close the gap. All this is very Jewish. Now there's a slight disagreement. What Paul is telling us is that God has crossed the gap and become flesh in order to save us. What Jews are saying is that God has called us to try to close the gap by reaching out across the other way and by growing up, becoming more mature, understanding God's way, and taking more active participation. That's the Paul versus Jewish way of responding to the same reality. Now my argument is both were right, and now in the 20th century, both are called to make the next move. What's the next move? The next move would be that the belief that God has become flesh can no longer be used as an excuse for Christians not to take full responsibility and not to confront the truth that in fact the world is not yet fully redeemed. And for Jews, the truth that humans are called upon to do more cannot be allowed to obscure the truth that we still need God's help and that we are not just human secularists, but we have some divine partnership here. So again, both groups are called upon to make a new move. In fact, if I had to summarize what I think is the unique religious calling of this century, I would say it is that the final triumph of the covenant is within our hands as human beings. I mean, think of the incredible potential wealth created in this country, created all over the world. Think of the incredible medical breakthroughs just beginning that really open up the serious possibility of overcoming sicknesses we never dreamt of overcoming infertility, of overcoming, I use that example because we have all the ambiguity of the disagreements, of overcoming infertility, of overcoming genetic diseases and malformations that never possible before. What an incredible, but if that power we take as humans is misunderstood and misused, then we have the power to wipe out the world. We have the power to have a brave new world of 1984 in which we take that power of fertility and turn it into breeding people in test tubes and manipulating people and using them as things. So will we use our power to be like God, to be an image of God, to be covenantal? Or will we use our power to become absolute human power, which is idolatry? And as we now know from the Holocaust, when you have absolute human power, it leads to hell on earth. So in this context, I believe that is the calling. So Paul's views can be treated by Jews with great respect as a religiously legitimate, even divinely revealed hermeneutic of Jesus' life as an interpretation of the Exodus which leads Christians and many Gentiles to God and toward the final perfection. Just as Jews are called to believe in the covenant through Exodus and through Sinai and through rabbinic teaching as their calling to work to the final perfection. Now I argue that both groups are called to improve upon what they've had so far, to go even further. If up to now we've had revelation without the fullness of human dignity of the other, now we can correct it. If up to now we've had revelation, but God has done more, we can do more now. If up to now women have not had a full role, women can now take a fuller role. So it's not that Jews should put down Paul anymore. I think Jews should affirm that Paul is a legitimate commentator in the long history of commentary upon the covenant, particularly for Christians. But Jews and Christians alike are challenged to write another commentary. A commentary growing out of our life experience, out of the experience of Holocaust and of Israel reborn, out of this experience of discovering each other's dignity. That commentary, I think, would go beyond Paul and would open up a genuine dialogue between the two religions, which maybe Paul ultimately hoped for also. After all, as you know now, within Romans 9 to 11, Paul also left open the hope that the Jews would be saved. I think we would now say to Paul, yes, a good Christian would now say to Paul, you are right, Jews will be saved, but not as you thought they would be saved. In fact, perhaps I could finish with that one story if I could. Paul did leave this legacy behind, which Christians today who wish to affirm Judaism have built upon. Paul was somehow convinced that the Jews, although they have not accepted Christ, will someday be saved. But in Paul's model, the way they'll be saved is someday, presumably, will finally discover Jesus. Now, I want to confess, before I tell you my final story, that for many years, although, as you can see, I was very positive and affirm about Christians, I always had this fantasy, nevertheless, that the Messiah will finally come, and of course it'll turn out that the Messiah will make clear to everybody that, the Jews were right all along, naturally, so the whole world will be redeemed, but of course, the Jews would get to sit at the dais or whatever it is. Anyway, I always had this imagination that that's the way it was going to be, and there was just as many good Christians who were willing to accept Judaism and work with me would say, look, let's work together till the final coming. And of course, in their mind, when the final coming would come, they would be upheld too. It dawned upon me one day I have sold God short. And I had the following fantasy. After all our efforts, and we've made all these major breakthroughs, the Messiah does come. Because after all, we could make these kind of breakthroughs. I believe the Messiah will come. I really do. After all these years, if people could overcome 1900 years legacy of hatred and misunderstanding and bitterness and achieve a true human cooperation understanding, that itself is the best proof the Messiah will come. Just as if Jews could come back from Auschwitz when death was totally triumphant and Jewish life was worth nothing, to come back from that experience and to restore life and to build an Israel and to prove that human life is infinitely precious again, this is the most miraculous proof that love is more powerful than death. So I became convinced that we would get together, we would finally bring the Messiah. And then I finally had this mental fantasy. The Messiah is finally coming, the whole world's transformed, and in the middle of the night, it gets light and the whole world is redeemed and the sick get cured and the dead come to life. What a remarkable, incredible, how delightful. And we all get together, and what happens next? It's obvious. They call a press conference. And it's obvious that the press conference was going to be the first question to the Messiah. The first question is going to be, is this your first coming or your second coming? Now, all my life I knew what the answer would be, just as Paul, in a sense, knew the answer, because he had great faith in God. It occurred to me now that I had it all wrong, because God's got a sense of humor and God has an infinite capacity for love. We're going to ask the Messiah, is this your first coming or your second coming? The Messiah is going to smile and answer, no comment.
It's the second coming, I'll tell you. What a delightful and provocative experience for all of us. And I really should have equal time. I must make at least one comment. And I see the theology of our faith emerging in many different ways. But the Christian concept of redemption is very much like the Jewish concept, except that we believe that Jesus gave us really the possibility of individual redemption. And so the struggle towards covenant, of which you speak, is what each Christian, towards which each Christian is challenged. And so we share that. And when I look over here to my right and your left and see the broken fiddle, the symbol of this lecture series, and the symbol of the suffering of the Jewish people and its recovery, I think to myself, together, we pull that thing together because we really are one. So thank you, Rabbi Greenberg.
That you are all invited to a reception at the pool balcony. It's just out the door and to your right.